Welcome to Passions Illustrated. Before starting the video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe.
The sound of the siren cut through the Portland night like a sharp blade. Maxwell Parker watched the scene for the 8th time, his hands shaking as he held the small device that had changed his life over the last few months. Across the street, Moonlight's Cafe glowed with its neon blue lights, and through the window he could see Isabella smiling as she served coffee to the late-night customers. 1942. The digital watch on his wrist flashed mercilessly. In 7 previous attempts, he had tried different approaches to prevent the inevitable. Now, at the age of 32, his temples were already showing premature gray hairs, physical marks of the repeated time journeys he had made. "You can't keep doing this to yourself," whispered Alexandra Bennett, the paramedic, who in some mysterious way seemed to be the only person besides him who retained memories of all the timelines. She was standing next to him, her green eyes conveying a mixture of compassion and concern. Maxwell ignored the comment, his eyes fixed on the cafe window. Isabella looked as beautiful as ever, her navy blue apron contrasting with her white blouse, her brown hair tied up in a messy bun. She didn't know that, in exactly 18 minutes, her life would change forever or end as it had for the last 7 attempts. The first time, Maxwell began to speak, his voice almost a whisper. "I tried to go into the cafe and warn her. She thought I was crazy." He laughed bitterly. "The second time, I tried to cause a blackout in the block. The third time, I called in a bomb threat." Alexandra put a hand on his shoulder, and each time the result was the same. The device in his hands, a small metal box with a digital display, had been his obsession ever since he found it in an abandoned laboratory near Mount Hood. He never fully understood how it worked, but he knew that it allowed him to go back in time for exactly 24 hours with a limit of 8 attempts. The first time he witnessed Isabella's death was purely accidental. He was crossing the street to meet her after his shift when it all happened. The drunk driver, the car going off the rails, Isabella coming out of the cafe. Maxwell closed his eyes, trying to push the memory away. "Have you ever thought that maybe—" Alexandra hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Some things are just meant to be." Maxwell turned to face her. Alexandra Bennett wasn't just a paramedic. Over the 8 iterations, she had become a constant in his chaotic life. In every attempt, she was there trying to save Isabella, comforting Maxwell, being the only person who inexplicably kept his memories intact. "How do you do it?" he asked. "How can you bear to see it happen again and again?" "Because I've learned that sometimes our job isn't to prevent tragedy, but to be there for those who remain," she replied, her eyes meeting his. 1953. Time continued its relentless advance. Maxwell watched as Isabella began to pack her things to leave. In some of his previous attempts, he had managed to delay her by a few minutes, but fate always found a way to manifest itself. "Do you know what's most cruel?" Maxwell asked, his voice embittered. "With each attempt, I learned something new about her. Things I never knew in our 3 years together. On the 5th attempt, I discovered that she had a collection of old stamps. On the 6th, that she dreamed of opening her own coffee shop on the Oregon coast." Alexandra remained silent, her gaze alternating between Maxwell and the coffee. The night was particularly cold for September, and small clouds of steam formed with every breath. 7:58 p.m. Isabella picked up her bag and waved to her coworkers. Maxwell felt his heart racing. For the first time in 8 attempts, he didn't have a plan. There was no elaborate strategy, no desperate attempt to alter fate. "What are you going to do this time?" Alexandra asked softly. "Nothing," Maxwell replied, his voice breaking. "I'm just going to be there." Isabella left the cafe, the doorbell tinkling softly. She stopped for a moment to adjust her scarf, and Maxwell realized that he had never noticed how gracefully she did it, a small smile playing on her lips as her fingers worked at the fabric. 2000. The sound of tires singing on the asphalt. Maxwell closed his eyes, but Alexandra held his hand, making him open them. "Sometimes," she said, "we need to witness to understand." The impact was quick as always. The red car, the muffled scream, the sound of breaking glass. But this time, Maxwell didn't run. He didn't shout. He didn't try to intervene. He just stood there holding Alexandra's hand as silent tears streamed down his face. Sirens began to sound in the distance. Alexandra squeezed his hand one last time before rushing off to do her job, even though she knew the outcome. Maxwell watched as she knelt beside Isabella, her precise professional movements masking the pain he knew she felt too. The device in his hand emitted one last beep before going completely dark. 8 attempts. 8 failures. But somehow this last time seemed different. There was no more anger, just a deep sadness and surprisingly a touch of acceptance. Maxwell stowed the device in his jacket pocket and walked slowly to the scene of the accident. The lights of the cars and the ambulance painted the street red and blue, creating dancing shadows on the walls of the buildings. Alexandra was filling in some forms, her face a mask of professionalism that barely hid her own pain. "And now?" he asked as she approached. "Now," she replied, putting a hand on his shoulder. "You learn to live with the memories. All of them. The old and the new. The happy ones and the painful ones." Maxwell looked up at the Portland night sky, the stars barely visible through the city's light pollution. 8 different versions of the same night, and only now was he beginning to understand that perhaps the purpose had never been to save Isabella, but to learn to say goodbye. 3 days after the last attempt to save Isabella, Maxwell found himself in his Pearl District apartment surrounded by photographs spread out on the coffee table. Each image captured a different moment with Isabella, but now they carried the added weight of the 8 different timelines he had lived through. "You need to eat," said Alexandra, placing a cup of coffee and a sandwich next to the photos. She had become a constant presence since that last night, worried that Maxwell might do something reckless with the temporal device, even though it was now completely inert. Maxwell picked up a specific photo, Isabella smiling in front of Powell's books, holding a worn copy of The Hill of the Howling Winds. "You know what's ironic? On the 7th try, I discovered that she hated this book. I always pretended. It was her favorite because it was the first present I ever gave her." Alexandra sat down on the sofa next to him, her green eyes studying the photographs. "Maybe that's why the universe allowed you to come back so many times. Not to save her, but to really get to know her." The idea reverberated in Maxwell's mind. With each timeline, he had discovered a new facet of Isabella: her secret fear of thunder, her passion for amateur astronomy, her unfulfilled dream of visiting Kyoto. They were pieces of a puzzle that he had never dedicated himself to putting together during their 3-year relationship. "Why do you think you kept your memories?" Maxwell asked Alexandra, turning to face her. "Of all people, why you?" Alexandra hesitated, playing with the silver chain around her neck. "Maybe because someone had to be there to witness it. To make sure you didn't get completely lost in this impossible mission." Maxwell stood up and walked over to the window. Portland stretched out below the fine rain, creating a diffuse glow in the city lights. In one of the timelines, he and Isabella had planned to move into an apartment exactly like this one. On the 4th attempt, Maxwell began, his voice low, "I followed her all day. I discovered that she visited a nursing home every Wednesday to read to the elderly. She never told me about it." Alexandra approached, stopping beside him. "Sometimes we keep secrets not because we're ashamed, but because some aspects of our lives are so personal that we guard them like private treasures." A distant clap of thunder startled Maxwell. "In one of the timelines, you told me something about fate, something about how some things are inevitable. And you think her death was inevitable." Maxwell closed his eyes, remembering each attempt. The pattern was starting to become clear. When he stopped the car accident, Isabella suffered a different accident. When he kept her away from the cafe, something even more tragic happened. "I think I was so focused on saving her that I forgot to really live the moments with her," he admitted. "With each new attempt, I was more worried about the plan than the person." Alexandra put a hand on his shoulder, the gentle touch bringing unexpected comfort. "Do you know what I observed all 8 times?" In the last moments when you weren't interfering, she always seemed at peace, as if somehow she knew that her time was limited and was at peace with that. Maxwell picked up another photo of the table, this one taken in the Japanese garden. Isabella, looking at something outside the frame, a serene smile on her face. In the last shot when I just watched, it was the first time I really saw her smile in those final moments. She looked complete. Maybe that's the real lesson, Alexandra suggested. It's not about how much time we have, but how we live each moment. Maxwell's phone vibrated. It was a message from work asking when he would be back. A software engineer, he had the privilege of working remotely, but he knew he had to return to the routine eventually. You can't live forever in this apartment surrounded by memories, Alexandra said softly. Isabella wouldn't want that. Maxwell looked at the paramedic, noticing for the first time the small details on her face, the small scar near her left eyebrow, the way her green eyes seemed to change shade depending on the light, the gentle but firm way she looked at him. "How do you cope?" he asked. "Watching people die in your work day after day, I've learned that my role is not only to save lives but also to provide dignity in the final moments and comfort for those who remain," she replied. "Every person I lose teaches me something about life." Maxwell slowly collected the photos, arranging them in an orderly pile. Each image now carried not only the memory of the moment captured, but also the discoveries of 8 different timelines. "I think I need to learn to live again," he said, his voice firmer than it had been in days. "Not just to exist, but to really live." Alexandra smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her face. "And that's why I'm here, to make sure you don't lose your way." The rain began to fall more heavily outside, but inside the apartment, something had changed. Isabella's memories, instead of anchors holding him to the past, were beginning to turn into lessons about love life and acceptance. And, by his side, Alexandra remained a constant, a silent witness to his journey through time and pain, gently guiding him back to life. Maxwell found that returning to work was more challenging than he had imagined. Sitting at his desk at Quantum Technologies, he stared at lines of code that seemed to shuffle before his eyes. Each algorithm made him think of the time device now stored in a metal box at the bottom of his drawer. "Hey, Max, we have a meeting in 5 minutes, announced Rachel, his teammate, placing a coffee on his desk. "You seem to need this more than I do." He forced a smile, but his mind wandered to Alexandra. Over the past 2 weeks, she had become a constant presence in his life, dropping by with food when he forgot to eat, listening to his stories about Isabella, and simply being there when the silence became too deafening. During the meeting, Maxwell could barely concentrate. His supervisor was discussing a new artificial intelligence project, but all he could think about was how in one of the timelines Isabella had mentioned her fascination with AI. "Imagine being able to program memories," she had said, "as if we were all little computers waiting for an update." After work, Maxwell drove to Mount Hood National Forest where he had found the temporal device months ago. The abandoned laboratory remained untouched, covered in ivy and oblivion. Alexandra found him there as if she knew instinctively where he would be. "I thought I'd find you here," she said, approaching. "Today marks a month since the last attempt." Maxwell ran his hand along the moss-covered wall of the laboratory. "Do you know what's strangest? In every timeline, you were not only at the scene of the accident, but you also appeared at random times during the day, as if the universe was trying to tell me something I was too busy to notice." Alexandra sat on a nearby rock, her paramedic uniform contrasting with the green of the forest. "Maybe because some people are meant to be part of our lives, even if we don't realize it immediately. Now, in the 3rd timeline," Maxwell continued, "you were in the same cafe where Isabella worked 2 hours before the accident. On the 5th, you were in the bookstore where I tried to keep her busy. And each time you were so focused on saving her that you barely noticed me," Alexandra added softly. The wind whispered between the trees, bringing the smell of pine and wet earth. Maxwell remembered how Isabella used to love hiking in this very forest, always stopping to photograph little details that others would overlook. "Yesterday," Maxwell said, turning to Alexandra. "I picked up my phone to tell Isabella something funny. It was automatic. Then I remembered, and it hurt like the first time." Alexandra stood up, moving closer to him. "Grief isn't linear, Max. There's no manual telling you how or when to get over the loss of someone you love. But what about when we mix 8 different versions of loss? How do I process that?" She took his hand, a gesture that had become natural between them. One memory at a time. One day at a time. On the way back to Portland, they stopped at a small roadside restaurant. Maxwell realized that it was the first time in weeks that he had actually felt hungry. "Tell me about Alexandra from each timeline," he asked as they shared an apple pie. "How was it for you?" She paused, considering the question. "In each version, I saw a man desperate to save someone he loved, and all I could do was be there. It was educational to see how different choices led to different outcomes, even if the ending remained the same. Do you think there's a greater purpose to all this? I believe that sometimes the universe forces us to face certain truths, even if we need to relive the same day 8 times to understand them." Maxwell watched Alexandra as she spoke, noticing how her eyes shone with a wisdom that went beyond her years. In every timeline, she had been his anchor, even when he was too busy trying to change fate to notice. "Do you know what Isabella told me in the 6th timeline?" Maxwell shared. "She said that she believed some people were like guiding stars, always there even when you can't see them clearly." Alexandra smiled, a soft smile that carried understanding, and something more, something Maxwell wasn't yet ready to name. "And what do you think she meant by that?" "At the time, I thought she was talking about our connection. Now, I'm not so sure." The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Maxwell thought about how each sunset he saw now carried the weight of 8 different versions of the same story, each adding a new layer of meaning to his life. "Tomorrow," Alexandra said as they walked back to the car, "I'm going to take you somewhere special. Something tells me you're ready to take the next step." Maxwell nodded, realizing that for the first time since everything had happened, he was actually curious about the future rather than stuck in the past. As he drove back to Portland with Alexandra asleep in the passenger seat, he reflected on how fate had curious ways of weaving its patterns, intertwining lives and stories in ways that only made sense when seen from afar. The special place Alexandra had mentioned was a small observatory on the outskirts of Portland. The circular building with its silver dome reflecting the afternoon sun looked lonely against the October sky. "Isabella used to come here," Maxwell said, surprising Alexandra. In the 2nd timeline, she mentioned that she had an annual pass. Alexandra smiled, taking a set of keys from her pocket. "I know. In fact, that's why I chose this place. I volunteer here at weekends." The inside of the observatory was cool and quiet. Alexandra guided Maxwell through corridors decorated with photographs of the cosmos until they reached the main room where a huge telescope occupied the center of the room. In one of the timelines, Maxwell began touching the cold metal of the telescope. "Isabella talked about wanting to see the Pleiades. I never understood why she had this particular fascination. The Pleiades are also known as the 7 Sisters," Alexandra explained, adjusting some of the telescope's controls. In Greek mythology, they were nymphs transformed into stars to escape the pursuit of Orion. But the interesting thing is that although they are called the 7 Sisters, most people can only see 6 stars with the naked eye. Maxwell thought about the 8 attempts to save Isabella, the different versions of her he had met. Some things are only visible when you look closer. Alexandra nodded, continuing to work on the adjustments. "Did you know that some ancient cultures believed that stars were holes in the sky, that through them we could see the divine light, shining from the other side? And what do you think? I think that sometimes we need holes in our reality to see other possibilities." The sun was beginning to set and the room gradually sank into darkness. Alexandra flicked a switch and the ceiling of the dome slowly began to open, revealing the twilight sky. During my time travels, Maxwell said, his voice low, I began to notice patterns. Not just about Isabella, but about you too. In each timeline you were there not just as a paramedic, but as a kind of guardian. Alexandra turned away from the telescope, her eyes meeting his in the semi-darkness. Maybe because some people are destined to meet, even if the path is tortuous. On the 7th try, Maxwell continued, you told me something about how some people are like constellations in our lives. They seem distant but are actually part of a larger pattern. And you believe that now? Maxwell approached the telescope, looking through the lens. The first stars were beginning to appear in the darkened sky. I'm beginning to believe that maybe the purpose of time travel wasn't to save Isabella, but to make me understand something about connections and destiny. Alexandra touched his arm gently. Look, she said, adjusting the telescope. The Pleiades are starting to appear. Through the lens, Maxwell saw the cluster of stars glittering like diamonds scattered on black velvet. It's amazing how something so far away can look so close through the right lens. Like memories, Alexandra added. Sometimes we need the right perspective to understand them better. They spent the next few hours observing different constellations with Alexandra explaining the stories behind each one. Maxwell realized that it was the first time since the accident that he felt truly present in the moment, not lost in memories or regrets. You know what's funny? He said as they watched Orion. In every timeline you tried to tell me something important, but I was too busy trying to change the inevitable to listen. And what do you think I was trying to say? Maxwell turned away from the telescope, staring at Alexandra. In the soft starlight, his green eyes seemed to contain their own universe of untold stories. That sometimes what we're looking for isn't necessarily what we need to find, he replied. That, maybe. All this time traveling through timelines wasn't about saving Isabella, but about learning to live without her and discovering. Yeah. Discover what? Alexandra asked softly. That some people come into our lives just when we need them, even if we don't realize it immediately. The silence that followed was filled only by the soft hum of the observatory's equipment and the distant sound of the city below. Alexandra moved to close the dome, her hands expert on the controls. Max, she said, using the diminutive form of his name for the first time. Have you ever wondered why, of all people, only I have retained the memories of the different timelines? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with unspoken meanings. Maxwell thought of all the times Alexandra had been there, not just as a witness to his pain, but as an anchor in the midst of the temporal chaos he had created. Maybe, he replied slowly, because some stories need more than one try to be told correctly. Alexandra smiled a smile that seemed to contain all the stars they had observed that night. And some people need to experience multiple endings to find the true beginning. As they left the observatory, night had completely settled over Portland. The city lights twinkled below, creating their own earthly version of the starry sky they had just observed. Tomorrow, Alexandra said as they walked to the parking lot, there's a place I'd like to show you. A place that Isabella used to visit, but that you never knew about. Maxwell nodded, realizing that each new discovery about Isabella no longer brought only pain, but also a kind of peace. And by his side, Alexandra remained his constant, his guiding star through this new constellation of possibilities that was forming in his life. The Cedar Springs Asylum was not the kind of place Maxwell would have expected to find connections with Isabella. Yet there he was, following Alexandra through the well-lit corridors of the facility on a Wednesday afternoon. This was her secret. Routine, Alexandra explained, nodding to a passing nurse. Every Wednesday she came here to read to the residents. I found out about it during my extra shifts. Maxwell remembered the fourth timeline when he had followed Isabella and seen her enter the place but never knew exactly what she was doing there. The discovery now seemed even more significant. Miss Eleanor, Alexandra called out, knocking softly on the door of one of the rooms. An elderly woman with silver hair raised her eyes from the book she was reading, her face lighting up at the sight of Alexandra. "Alexandra, dear, and who is your friend?" "This is Maxwell Parker," Alexandra introduced. He was close to Isabella. Mrs. Eleanor's face changed subtly, a look of recognition and sadness passing through her eyes. "Oh, yes. Isabella talked about you a lot. Please, sit down." Maxwell looked around the room, noticing the various photographs on the walls. In one of them, he recognized Isabella sitting next to Mrs. Eleanor, both smiling at the camera, an open book between them. "Isabella started visiting me 2 years ago," Eleanor shared, adjusting her glasses. "She said I reminded her of her grandmother who had died when she was a child. We started with The Hill of the Howling Winds. She hated the book, you know." Maxwell couldn't help but smile sadly. "Yes, I found that out recently. But she kept reading it because she knew it was my favorite," Eleanor continued. "That's the kind of person she was, always putting others first." Alexandra sat on the edge of Eleanor's bed, taking her wrinkled hand. "Lady Eleanor has been my patient for years. That's how I first met Isabella, long before." Maxwell realized then that the connections between Alexandra and Isabella ran deeper than he had imagined. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Some stories need the right moment to be told," Alexandra replied softly. "And some connections only make sense when seen in retrospect." Eleanor reached over to her bedside table, picking up a yellowed envelope. "Isabella left this with me a few weeks ago. She said it was to give to you if anything happened to her. I think she somehow knew." Maxwell picked up the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a letter and an old photograph. In the picture, a young Isabella was hugging her grandmother, both sitting in an observatory that he recognized immediately, the same one Alexandra had shown him the night before. "Dear Max," he began to read aloud, Isabella's delicate handwriting dancing before his eyes. "If you're reading this, it means that something has happened to me. There's so much I wanted to tell you, so many little details of my life that I've kept to myself. Not for lack of confidence, but because I believed that some stories needed to mature before they could be shared." Maxwell paused, his voice breaking. Alexandra put a hand on his shoulder, offering silent support. "My grandmother used to say that there are people who are like guiding stars in our lives. Some shine brightly for a short time, while others remain constant, guiding us through the darkness. You, Max, were my shining star. But there is someone else who is also important in my story, even if you don't know it yet." Maxwell looked at Alexandra, who had tears in her eyes. "Alexandra Bennett has been my silent friend for years," the letter continued. "She was there when my grandmother passed away in Cedar Springs, offering comfort to a stranger. It was she who inspired me to start the weekly readings here, and I know somehow that she'll be there for you when I can't be anymore." The silence that followed was filled only by the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Eleanor took a handkerchief from her bedside table, wiping her eyes. "Isabella had a special gift," the old woman finally said. "She could see the connections between people even when they couldn't see it themselves." Maxwell folded the letter carefully, his mind processing all the new information. In 8 different timelines, he had discovered different aspects of Isabella, but only now was he beginning to understand the full picture. "You knew," he said to Alexandra. "In all those attempts, you knew a lot more than you showed." Alexandra nodded slowly. "Some truths need to be discovered in their own time, Max. I couldn't just tell you everything. You had to be ready to understand." Eleanor picked up the book on her lap, a worn edition of The Hill of the Howling Winds. "Isabella always said that the best stories are the ones that surprise you even when you think you already know the ending." Maxwell looked out of his bedroom window, watching the sunset paint the Portland sky in shades of pink and gold. He thought about all the invisible connections that had existed in his life, how the universe had woven a complex web of relationships that he was only now beginning to understand. "I think I finally understand," he said softly. Why the device allowed 8 attempts. It wasn't about changing the past, it was about revealing truths that were hidden in plain sight. The soft noise of the coffee maker filled Maxwell's kitchen as he reviewed the notes scattered on the table. He had created a detailed map connecting all the events of the 8 timelines, trying to find patterns that might have escaped his notice. "You've turned your kitchen into an investigative painting," Alexandra commented, entering the apartment with a box of donuts. She had started using the spare key Maxwell had given her the week before after realizing that his visits had become an essential part of her routine. "I've been thinking about what Isabella wrote in her letter," Maxwell replied, marking another point on his makeshift map. "About people being guiding stars. In every timeline there were moments when the two of you crossed paths even before the accident." Alexandra moved closer, studying the notes. Her eyes traveled along the lines that connected different event dates and places. "Are you looking for a greater meaning in all this? Look at this." Maxwell pointed to a specific date. 3 months before the accident, in all the timelines, you and Isabella were in the same cafe on Mount Hood. It was always a Sunday, always at 2:43 in the afternoon. "The Evergreen Cafe," Alexandra muttered, recognizing the place. "I used to stop there after my weekend shifts at the observatory." Maxwell picked up another note. "And 2 weeks before the accident, you were both at the same screening of Casablanca at the Hollywood Theater. Isabella cried at the end in all 8 versions." "Some love stories are meant to end," Alexandra said softly, "so that others can begin." Maxwell stopped absorbing the weight of those words. For the first time, he didn't feel the usual pang of guilt as he considered the possibility of moving on. "I found this yesterday," he said, picking up a small diary of Isabella's that Eleanor had handed him. "There's an entry about you from 6 months ago." Alexandra sat down, her forgotten coffee beginning to cool. Maxwell opened the diary to a marked page. "I saw Alexandra again today at Cedar Springs. There's something special about the way she cares for people, as if she can see beyond their momentary pain. Sometimes I wonder if Max and she have ever met. It would be interesting to see how 2 such important people in my life would relate. Maybe one day." She was trying to connect us, Alexandra realized, her voice breaking. "Even before. In every timeline," Maxwell continued, "you were there not only as a paramedic, but as a kind of silent guardian. Did Isabella know that?" "Not exactly," Alexandra replied, playing with the chain around her neck, a habit Maxwell had noticed was more frequent when she was emotionally involved. "But she always said she believed in synchronicities and how the universe arranged seemingly chance encounters." Maxwell stood up, walking over to the window. Portland stretched out below the city, beginning to awaken under the morning sky. "Do you know what's most surreal? With every attempt to save Isabella, I ended up discovering more about you too. As if the real purpose was." "Was what?" Alexandra asked, joining him at the window. "As if the purpose was to make me understand. That sometimes we lose something precious in order to find something just as valuable, only in a different way." The silence that followed was comfortable, full of unspoken possibilities. Maxwell thought about how the temporal device had stopped working exactly after his last attempt, as if his mission had been accomplished. Isabella had a theory, Alexandra shared, about how some people are like constellations in our lives. Some stars may fade, but the pattern is still there, guiding us. Maxwell looked at her, noticing how the morning light created a soft halo around her hair. "And what do you think our pattern is?" "Maybe," she replied, her eyes meeting his. "We're part of a larger constellation that Isabella helped draw. Not by chance, but by choice, hers and fate's." Maxwell took the inert temporal device from its drawer, studying its darkened dial. "I think I finally understand why it took me 8 tries. It wasn't about changing the past, it was about accepting the present and seeing the future from a new perspective." Alexandra touched the device gently. "Sometimes we need to lose ourselves completely to find our true path." The sun had fully risen now, bathing the apartment in golden light. Maxwell put the device away and began to collect his notes. Each piece of paper told not only the story of his loss, but also the story of a new beginning. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'd like to visit a place with you. A place that means a lot to me and Isabella, but which can now mean something new." Alexandra smiled, understanding. "The observatory." "No." Maxwell replied, a small smile forming on his lips. "The place where it all began, the abandoned laboratory. I think it's time to close one cycle and maybe start another." Alexandra nodded, understanding the significance of that moment. As they organized the kitchen together, moving in a silent, synchronized dance, Maxwell realized that some stories don't need time travel to be extraordinary. Sometimes they just need the right time and the right people to unfold naturally. The abandoned laboratory looked smaller than Maxwell remembered. The ivy had grown even more, almost completely engulfing the concrete structure. Alexandra walked beside him, her footsteps echoing on the rusty metal floor. "It was right here," Maxwell said, stopping in front of an old dust-covered control panel. The device was in a locked drawer. "I never understood why it chose to find me." Alexandra ran her fingers along the panel, revealing faded inscriptions. "Maybe it wasn't the device that chose you. Maybe it was Isabella somehow guiding you through time to this moment." Maxwell took the inert device out of his pocket, its familiar weight in his hands. The memories of the 8 timelines overlapped in his mind. Isabella smiling in the cafe, Alexandra always present on the outskirts of every attempt, Mrs. Eleanor with her stories in the asylum. "Do you know what I discovered yesterday?" he asked, turning the device over in his hands. This laboratory belonged to Isabella's grandmother. She was a quantum physicist working on theories about time travel. Alexandra stopped examining the panel, turning to him in surprise. "How did you find out about this?" "I found more notes in her diary. Isabella knew about this place, about her grandmother's work. She used to come here as a child." Maxwell opened the diary, showing a child's drawing of the laboratory. "She drew this when she was 8. "So, it's no coincidence that you found the device here," Alexandra concluded, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Isabella wrote about how her grandmother believed that time wasn't linear, but a web of interconnected possibilities. That some people were destined to meet no matter how many turns the universe had to take. A ray of sunlight penetrated through a crack in the ceiling, illuminating the space between them. Maxwell thought about how light always found a way, even in the most unlikely places. In the last diary entry, he continued, his voice soft, Isabella wrote about a dream she had. She was at the observatory with her grandmother watching the Pleiades. In the dream, her grandmother said that some stories need several attempts to find their true ending. Alexandra approached, taking the device from Maxwell's hands. "And what do you think the true ending of this story is?" "I don't think it's an ending," he replied, watching as the light played in Alexandra's green eyes. "It's a new beginning." She placed the device on the old control panel where it looked strangely at home. "Do you know what intrigues me the most? In every timeline, even when you managed to postpone the inevitable for a few hours or days, I always ended up finding you at some point. As if the universe was insisting on introducing us," Maxwell added, understanding. "Isabella once told me," Alexandra shared, "that she believed some people were like anchor points in time, people who help us find our way back no matter how far we've lost our way." Maxwell thought of all the times Alexandra had been there, not just as a witness to his pain, but as a silent constant, patiently waiting for him to be ready to see beyond his obsessive mission. "I think I understand now why you kept the memories of all the timelines," he said. "You were the point of connection, the constant that the universe, or perhaps Isabella, chose to guide me through this journey." Alexandra smiled a smile that carried understanding and promise. "And you were finally ready to see it." Together, they walked to the exit of the laboratory. The afternoon sun painted Mount Hood in golden hues, and a gentle breeze rustled the surrounding trees. "What do we do now?" Alexandra asked as they looked out over the valley below. "We live," Maxwell answered simply. Not in the past or in alternative possibilities, but here and now. And maybe, he hesitated for a moment, we can create our own constellation. Alexandra intertwined her fingers in his, the gesture as natural as breathing. Isabella would be happy with that. You know, she always believed that love had many forms and that some stories needed time to find their true course. Maxwell took one last look at the laboratory now bathed in the evening light. The place, where it all began, now seemed more like a portal to the future than an anchor in the past. Lady Eleanor asked me to continue the reading sessions, he mentioned. She said it would be a way of keeping a part of Isabella alive. And we will, he corrected softly. If you want to accompany me on this new story. Alexandra squeezed his hand in response, and together they started down the trail that led back to Portland. The time device was left behind, a silent reminder that some journeys don't need time machines, just open hearts and the courage to move on. On the horizon, the first stars began to appear, and Maxwell thought about how each one was part of a larger constellation. Just as each moment of his life, the 8 attempts the loss of Isabella meeting Alexandra were part of a larger picture that was only now beginning to make sense. The story wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. And this time, there was no need to go back in time. The present, with all its possibilities, was exactly where they needed to be.